Did you do your homework? I encouraged you to come with an area of need or a concern, a prayer request, an area where you need God to speak, to move, to work, to intervene in your life. Maybe it has to do with your future, maybe about university or college or work or a move or your finances or your marriage or your family or some other relationship. So do you have something in mind, an area where you're asking God to step in and work and move? Do you know what it is that you are asking God to do? Can you articulate that in a sentence? Can you say specifically, I am asking God to do this, so that you know whether or not God has answered or not? Are you that clear and specific in terms of what you're asking God to do? Now, before we go any further, just a quick question of evaluation. Is this request, is this desire that you have, is it self-centered or is it God-centered? Is it about you, or does it seek to bring glory and honor to the Father? That could be an uncomfortable question for us to face at times, but it is an important question to ask when we come before the Lord in prayer, so that we know what the source is for our concern, the source is of that need, the source is for that prayer, the motivation that's driving us to ask or seek God in a particular area. Okay, so moving on. Here's the real question I want to get to. How are you going to go about determining what God wants you to do in that area? How are you going to go about determining what the will of God is for you, what the next step is? How are you going to determine whether God has answered you or not in that particular area? How do you find clarity? How do you know the will of God? Now, for most of us, we just rely on our circumstances. We'll spiritualize it. So if we're praying for something and it happens, we say, well, God said yes. And if we're praying for something and it doesn't happen, we say, well, God said no. If we're praying for something and it doesn't happen right away, we say, well, God said, wait a while. Really, all we've done is taken our circumstances as God's answer to our prayer. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like hearing God to me. If I'm just waiting on my circumstances and then I go, oh, well, okay, I'll just kind of slap a God said sticker on that. That's not hearing God. That's not intimacy with God. And I don't know about you, but my desire is to hear God and develop intimacy with God. And so I wonder if most of us are not hearing God's voice at all, if we're just listening to our circumstances and then after the fact saying, oh, well, that must have been God. So that's what we want to look at. In the passage we read earlier, David has been anointed king. I asked you what you're struggling with. I asked you for a prayer need, a prayer concern. In David's instance, at this particular point in his life, the concern would have been, how does he become the king that God has anointed him to be? Saul is chasing him. Saul is after him to kill him. But David has been anointed and called of God to be king. God, how do I accomplish your will and take the throne? So in 1 Samuel chapter 24, Saul has assembled an army of 3,000 chosen men, and he has pursued David into the wilderness of En-Gedi. While they are hunting David, Saul needs to go to the bathroom, and so he ducks into a cave out of view. But what he doesn't know is that he's ducked into the precise cave where David and a few of his men are hiding. David's men see this as divine intervention. And they say to David, this is the day God told you was going to come. That moment when God gives your enemy into your hand. But David refuses to kill Saul. Now, if David is using his circumstances, a list of pros and cons, employing basic logic to hear God's voice, it's not an unrealistic interpretation to think that God has orchestrated these circumstances and put David as the rightful king in this situation so that he can take the throne. Let's run down the list. David has been anointed king by the rightful, unquestioned prophet of God. The Spirit of the Lord is on David, has rushed on him, we are told, and remained on David. David, not Saul, was used to take on Goliath and to push back the Philistines, the enemies of God's people. For David to take the throne would be a clear and righteous benefit for the nation of Israel. David has already married into the royal family, and even the crown prince Jonathan affirms that David will be king. Jonathan at one point says, look, David, my father knows it, I know it, you will be king, and I'll be right there alongside you. I don't need the throne. Saul has been rejected by God. Saul has been rejected by the prophet, significant portions of the army, and if not rejected by the people, Saul has at least been replaced as the national hero by David. I don't even know what number I'm on at this point. If David kills Saul, isn't it just a clear case of self-defense? Saul is after David with 3,000 men to kill him. So we talked in an earlier message about putting out a fleece when we looked at Gideon, and I suggested that they don't work and that that's not the will of God for us anyways, to be putting out fleeces. But what if we were to try a fleece in this situation? David says, God, if you want me to kill Saul and take the throne, you're going to have to set up the circumstances. David is not running around in the palace with a knife trying to hunt Saul down. He's not sneaking up on him in his royal bed trying to kill him. David is far away, and yet Saul chases him. And Saul ends up in the precise cave where David and his men are, right? I mean, it's like, it's a miracle that the circumstances have worked out this way. The advice and word of David's advisors affirm him that this is the Lord's doing. And did you catch the word of the Lord in 1 Samuel 24, verse 4? God had promised that this day would come. So listen, if David is given to putting out fleeces or acting as if circumstances are the voice of God, this is a no-brainer, and Saul is a dead man. If David has given himself to obeying the voice of his circumstances, this is as clear as it gets. If David has given himself to trusting the putting out of fleeces, this is as clear as it gets. But here's the thing. We don't need the Spirit within our lives. We don't need God's presence if we just plan to put out fleeces and trust circumstances. And I want the Spirit at work in my life. When we rely on circumstances, a shut door means no and an open door means yes. And I don't need the voice of God to discern that. I don't need the Spirit within. I just go around checking doorknobs, and the first door that's open, well, that must be the will of God. I guess I'll walk through it. If, on the other hand, I am committed to journeying with God and being led by the Spirit and knowing God and being in relationship with Almighty God, listen, I try a door and it's locked. That doesn't mean God doesn't want me to go through it, because a locked door is not an obstacle for God. The Red Sea won't cause me to turn back. Jericho's walls are no obstacles, and giants can be brought down with slingshots when God is with us. No circumstance can ever stand as an obstacle, so closed doors and mountains mean nothing. There is no door God cannot open. There is no mountain he cannot flatten. There is no sea he cannot part. There is no Goliath too big. David refuses to trust his circumstances. He lets Saul go free. Now, anyone who knows the story of David knows that David lets Saul go free, not because he's a pacifist. Clearly, there's something else that's going on here. Jump to chapter 26, where God gives David a second chance. 1 Samuel chapter 26. God gives David another opportunity to deal with Saul in this way and take the throne. The Ziphites betray David to King Saul. King Saul once again comes with 3,000 chosen men to kill David. David discovers that Saul is in the area. And in the middle of the night, David and a trusted friend sneak into Saul's camp. They walk up to Saul as he sleeps. And Abishai, David's friend, is like, dude, God has given you this opportunity. God has put Saul in your hands again. God has given the enemy into your hand. But again, David refuses to take Saul's life. Even though verse 12 says the reason nobody in the army wakes up, the reason Saul doesn't wake up, is because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon Saul and all his men. Run the tests again, and it becomes difficult to interpret these circumstances in any other way if I am living my life based on circumstances. Twice, David has had Saul at his mercy, and both times his advisors tell him to go for it. God seems to help out by keeping everyone asleep, but David refuses to listen to the voice of circumstances. Now, let me be very clear here. I am not in any way suggesting that God cannot, will not, or does not use circumstances at times to make his will and purpose known. I'll say it again. I am not in any way suggesting that God cannot, will not, or does not use circumstances at times to make his will and purpose known. I'm simply using a clear biblical example to try to show that sometimes circumstances are not the voice of God. That sometimes circumstances are not to be relied on. That circumstances are not the only way, and in some cases not at all the way in which God makes his will known. So I have this journal entry connected with this passage. Apparently a number of years ago, I woke up in the middle of the night with this passage on my mind. And as I lay there in my bed, the question that came to mind was this: why would David not kill Saul? If being on the throne was the goal, if that was the will of God, if the good of the nation was at stake, God had anointed and appointed David, the Spirit had rushed and remained on him, why would David not have seized this opportunity to, quote unquote, walk in the will of God and secure the throne? And as I lay there reflecting on that, I thought, what if David didn't want to do anything that he thought might jeopardize his relationship with God? What if David's desire was not so much for the throne, but for ongoing intimacy with God? What if David's thought was, well, yeah, I could kill this guy and get the throne, but what would murdering this guy in his sleep do to my relationship with a holy God? Often when we face challenges and struggles and hurdles and needs come into our life, we come to God not out of love or intimacy, but more concerned with having our prayer answered. What if God's main priority is our deepening relationship with him? And too often we completely forget about our relationship and we turn our gaze towards the thing we want fixed or the thing we want, period. We look at the obstacles, we look at the need, we look at our desires, and we find ourselves longing more for the thing, more for the fix, than for intimacy with the one we are praying to. So look at that thing that you have written earlier, that need, that concern about your future, about your family, about relationship, about studies. Look at that thing that you have written, that area where you need the Father's wisdom, that area of struggle. Is that thing more important to you than your relationship with God? Is that area more important than intimacy with the Father? Listen, whatever you face, whatever God invites you to, his purpose is deepening relationship. Look at that thing that you are seeking God for. It's nothing more than a setup for deepening intimacy with God. And I encourage you to use your journey through that area of concern, your journey in the midst of it, as an opportunity to lean into getting to know God better. Can I encourage you to make intimacy with God and hearing God the priority as you journey through that area, that struggle, that need, as you seek God in the midst of it? Seek God.